Introduction. Tihi first book of the Bharat trilogy. India, that is Bharat, coloniality, civilization, constitution, was structured in a manner so as to help Bharatiyas comprehend the construct of European coloniality so that the existence of that state of mind which afflicts the Bharatiya or Indic civilizational consciousness, to the present day, is both identified and acknowledged. To that end, based on primary sources and the work of non-Bharatiya and Bharatiya scholars, the book undertook a focused examination of the religious and racial undergirding of European coloniality and its impact the world over, Bharat being no exception, save for the degree and manner of this impact. In addition to European coloniality, the book introduced the construct of Middle Eastern coloniality and broadly summarized the ways in which it was both similar to and differed from its European counterpart. The rationale behind this was to bring to the fore the fact that unlike the Americas, Bharat has experienced two successive waves of colonization, in particular settler colonization, namely Middle Eastern and European, both of which have shaped its contemporary consciousness in their own distinct ways, albeit to the detriment of its indigeneity. In that context, I had taken the position that while seeking to rediscover Bharat's indigenous consciousness and reinscribe it onto its present and future, it is imperative to acknowledge the continuing existence and influence of both forms of expansionist colonialities whose ontology, epistemology and theology, OET-driven animus towards Bharat's indigeneity is a matter of irrefutable and documented fact. One of the central objectives of the first book, evident from its subtitle, was to present the birth of contemporary constitutionalism in Bharat as a continuum of the religious, social, political and economic structures established by the European colonizer in Bharat so that the politico-theological framework within which these structures operated became clear to the reader. The framework included the use of international law through application of the standard of civilization as the legal prerequisite for admission of countries to the International Comity of Nations. It was demonstrated that the reshaping of Bharat into a constitution-driven nation-state was not an isolated product of developments within Bharat as much as it was of Europe's. Read the West's remodeling of the world along European Western lines. To make this case, British parliamentary debates, the circumstances leading to the establishment of the League of Nations, and the Montford Report on Indian constitutional reforms, which led to the enactment of the first British-made constitution for Bharat, namely the Government of India Act of 1919, were delved into in some detail, having thus set the tone by providing a conceptual lens framework for a more specific assessment of the impact of coloniality on the development of constitutional thought. This book, the second in the trilogy, was originally intended to take the discussion forward by examining the critical period between 1919 and 1951. This would have covered within its ambit a. the enactment of the second British-made constitution for Bharat, namely the Government of India Act of 1935, b. international developments leading to the Second World War, which led to the founding of the United Nations in 1945. C. The partition of Bharat and the consequent creation of Pakistan. D. The framing of the Constitution of 1950. And E. The events leading to the First Amendment to the 1950 Constitution under the stewardship of the first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, aided by the first Law Minister, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. However, after perusing the literature and consulting with the research team, I concluded that in order to better understand the cogitations of the Constituent Assembly between 1946 and 1950, It was imperative to panoramically view the all-important period between 1905 and 1924, which witnessed a partnership of convenience between European and Middle Eastern colonialities. Therefore, not only is it important to assess the Constitution for the impact of European coloniality, it is equally imperative to examine it for the influence of Middle Eastern coloniality. This entails a discussion on a. The partition of Bengal on religious lines in 1905 and its subsequent reunification in 1911. b. The emergence of two factions within the Indian National Congress, namely the moderates, liberals, and the extremists, nationalists, following the partition of Bengal. c. The rise of Muslim political separatism and the consequent birth of the All India Muslim League in December 1906. d. The constitutional entrenchment of the two-nation theory through the introduction of separate electorates for Muslims through the Minto-Morley reforms of 1909. e. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 and the rise of the Khilafat movement in defense of the Ottoman Caliphate. f. The Jallianwala Bagh massacre. g. The enactment of the Government of India Act of 1919 based on the Montford Report on Constitutional Reforms. h. The launch of the Khilafat agitation in 1919 and the non-cooperation movement in 1920 to redress the Jallianwala Bagh massacre and the issue of the Khilafat. I. The outbreak of riots from 1921 to 1924, including the Mopla outrage of 1921 in the Malabar, and j. The end of the Khilafat agitation in 1924. To name a few. Critically, I realized that while the partition of Bengal in 1905 was indeed a concrete step in the general direction of the creation of Pakistan, an analysis of the Pakistan movement in its entirety would be incomplete without reference to the rise of pan-Islamic movements in Bharat in the 18th and 19th centuries in the aftermath of the decline of the Mughal Empire following the death of Aurangzeb in 1707. This is because these movements sowed the seeds of Pakistan well before Syed Ahmed Khan or Muhammad Iqbal or Muhammad Ali Jinnah showed up on the scene. In other words, it is my case that the idea of Pakistan was born much earlier through these movements but was only given a name and effect to between 1905 and 1947. Naturally, each of these events had varying degrees of influence on issues linked to consciousness that arose for constitutional cogitation between 1925 and 1950, such as the very identity of Bharat, the characterization of the future Bharatiya state, the purpose and framework of the Constitution, citizenship, the discourse surrounding fundamental rights, the definition and treatment of religious minorities, and the like. Therefore, unless the period between 1905 and 1924 is made sense of, with a necessary and detailed prelude that discusses the genesis of pan-Islamic movements of the 1700s and the 1800s in the Bharatiya subcontinent, the assessment of the combined impact of European and Middle Eastern colonialities, if any, on the framing of the Constitution of 1950 would be truncated and historically uninformed. In light of this, I have consciously redrawn the core timeline of this book to the period between 1905 and 1924 set against the backdrop of pan-Islamic movements starting from the 1740s. Consequently, in the third book of the trilogy, I will examine the combined impact of European and Middle Eastern colonialities on the evolution of constitutional thought between 1925 and 1950. While this decision of mine significantly alters the originally intended scope of this book and the next, the theme and intention remain the same as the first book, which is reflected in the title of this book, namely India, Bharat and Pakistan, the constitutional journey of a sandwiched civilization. The other important objective of this book is to help the reader draw parallels between the challenges faced by the Indic civilization during the tumultuous period of 1905 to 1924 on the one hand, and present-day Bharat on the other. It is my position, based on my reading, that the very same attitudes which ultimately led to the partition of Bharat in 1947 are still alive and kicking, albeit under sanitized labels. One of the reasons for adopting the above approach to a decolonial revisitation of the Constitution is to drive home the point that it is a document which must be understood against the backdrop of history. Yet another objective is to reinforce my position that supreme deliberations on constitutional morality, which are rooted in politico-theological frameworks that have no love lost for Indic indigeneity, are devoid of a sense of history and end up preserving constitutionalism at the expense of the civilization. Conventional constitutional scholarship merely looks for the intent of the framers of the Constitution by sifting through the debates of the Constituent Assembly, but rarely looks for causal factors in history, particularly coloniality, which expressly birthed such intent or shaped it unconsciously. It is for this reason that before plunging headlong into the deliberations of the Constituent Assembly, I thought it necessary to first analyze the national and international developments preceding them. I hope this decision of mine aids the reader in connecting the dots between these developments and the worldview and intent of the framers of the Constitution as distilled from the proceedings of the Constituent Assembly, a subject that shall be delved into in the third book of this trilogy. As in the case of the first book, while it is not possible to cover every development, an attempt has been made to cover those which evidence suggests had or ought to have had a significant bearing upon the shaping of political thought which eventually translated into legislative action of far-reaching consequence or contributed to the evolution of contemporary constitutional thought in Bharat. Given the nature of this exercise and its end goal, which is that this book may serve as the bridge between the first and the third books, in the interest of fluidity and organization of thought and discussion, the division of this book is based on broad timelines. Accordingly, the first section covers the period from 1740 to 1898, the second section the period from 1899 to 1909, and the final section from 1910 to 1924. A bit of back and forth between the sections is to be expected. However, in light of the feedback received to the first book from readers, I have attempted to keep the language simple, sentence construction short and the narration lucid without altering my core style of presentation. Also, drawing a lesson from decolonial thought, I have used the word contemporary as a substitute for modern wherever possible and applicable, so as to avoid the colonial baggage that comes with the use of the latter. While I do hope that this book proves to be a worthy sequel to the first, the larger goal remains unaltered: to exhort Bharatiyas to take history and its study seriously, especially in the context of the Constitution, so that the misplaced sense of religiosity towards the document is replaced with a sense of proportion, perspective and purpose. As always, I leave it to the reader and posterity to determine if I have succeeded in my endeavor in the service of the Bharatiya civilization.